Hello, I'm Charlie Parrish,
Hi, I'm Katie Otto.
and Cora Dodson could not be here with us today, but we're here to talk about our paper related to talent migration in NCAA Division I tennis. And I want to point out that this is part one of a two-part study. So this part one is more or less a descriptive exploratory analysis. Part two will look at the relationship between the percentage of international players on a given roster and whether or not that team wins. So we'll begin with a brief discussion about what migration is.
Yeah. So thanks, Charlie. So migrate. Why do people migrate? Why do people leave their homeland? Historically speaking, it's had to do with changing climate, conquests, displacement, and more recently, we've seen issues of conflict and war, poverty. As we definitely have these issues going on today, as we have immigration issues in our own country due to these conflicts, poverty issues. And then at likely a higher level, we have people wanting to leave their country for reasons of trying to better their life from the education perspective or employment perspective. So quickly, if you look at that globe there of the world, you'll see that the cool colors indicate where people are leaving from, toward the warmer colors of orange and red, where they're coming to. Go ahead. So are athletes any different? I mean, not really. When you think of the fact that we're working inside of a capitalistic ideology, then athletes who are achievement oriented are going to be no different than skilled laborers who want to achieve so that they can attain a better lot in life as well. So basically, you're seeing the migration patterns that will operate within a single country. They'll operate between countries, and they'll also even operate from continent to continent, as you saw on the slide before. So what undergirds this whole notion of migration, whether it's migration of people, whether it's migration of skilled labor or athletic talent, is truly the hegemon culture, which, as we know, is now transnational, and it's capitalism. And so inside of this system, with achievement being one of the highest values, you can see that people, athletes, skilled laborers want to move toward what's called the core to better their lot in life. And if you look at the sport system as a micro system, you're going to see that the athlete is actually a commodity inside of that sports system. So it really mirrors Marx's critique of capitalism, where he talks about the owner-worker relationship. And inside of that relationship, sport specifically, you're going to see that the sport laborers are really producing a product for the owners that's known as the spectacle of competition. It's almost a myth, if you will. They're trying to create this notion for the fans that, you know, two people or two entities are competing against one another. So working from Marx and this notion of capitalism, we have a theoretical framework that we expanded to, and clearly we're looking at a global framework, the notion of globalization, where the world economy is basically reconfigured in such a way that it mirrors the capitalistic values and the capitalistic economy. So we used Wallerstein's world system theory as a really nice way to frame this study. And as you'll see here, there's three circles representing the three types of regions, right? And you have the core in the middle that's basically pulling semi-periphery and peripheral nations, materials and labor toward the middle, toward itself, grabbing hold of the best that it can grab in order to produce a product and to make money. And what's really interesting about Wallerstein's world system theory too, is that those three balls, if you will, they're dependent on each other, right? So the core needs the periphery and the semi-periphery, and just the same as Mark's noted in his critique, just the same, the periphery and the semi-periphery need the core. So it's a bit of a perverted relationship, if you will, because it's an unequal exchange. And it really is this notion of the strong controlling the weak, and this odd interdependence between the two.
All right, so moving on, there's quite a bit of literature out there that focuses on sport labor migration. And you can just see a snippet of some of these studies. Just a few I want to point out. Stidwell did one of the earlier studies in the United States looking at international student athletes. This is a PhD dissertation from Oregon State University. And he was just trying to understand the motives of international track and field athletes and as well as domestic track and field athletes. John Bale did some pioneering work with respect to international student athletes migrating to U.S. colleges, universities. In particular, his 1991 book, The Brawn Drain, was very influential with a number of labor migration studies. There's been labor migration studies produced in the context of global sport. Joseph McGuire is one of the big names there. There's been studies looking at why ice hockey players migrate to other countries. There's a study on North American basketball players that have migrated to play in British leagues. And so we just wanted to mention a few of those. There's obviously a whole literature base that looks at international student athletes competing at U.S. colleges and universities. And again, stemming from Stidwell's early work and Bale's work. And you can kind of conceptualize many of these fitting into two overarching frameworks, one being more or less the experiences of international student athletes competing at U.S. colleges and universities, as well as motivation for these student athletes to migrate to U.S. colleges and universities. There's several others that don't fit neatly into those two categories, and you can kind of see those listed on the matrix on the screen. But I want to point out two in particular that were influential in this particular study. One by Cheputore Thompson, Turcotte, and Smith. They looked at the migration patterns of Division I men's basketball players. And what they found was Canada and Australia, Nigeria, Germany, and England were the top donor countries for international student athletes competing in men's basketball. They also looked at where these athletes tended to migrate in terms of which conferences. So which conferences tended to recruit and attract international basketball talent. Another study that was done recently, I believe it was published in 18 or 19, looked at soccer athletes. So they looked at U.S. Men's college soccer rosters and investigated the number of internationals competing on those rosters. And you can see as well by the graphic on the screen which donor countries tended to produce this talent that ended up in the United States competing for U.S. colleges and universities. And again, this graphic, this is lifted directly from that publication by Kirk and Weaver, where they looked at where these athletes tended to migrate to. So the idea of the colors that you're seeing on the screen, the darker the color, this is a higher concentration of international soccer talent in the United States at U.S. colleges and universities. And so I mentioned those two because this study was really inspired by those. What we're doing is we're looking at tennis. And so we had a few research questions that we wanted to explore. One being, looking at the percentage of international student athletes competing in tennis in comparison to other NCAA Division I programs. The second research question, looking at the distribution of international student athletes in terms of whether they're landing in Power 5 conferences, Group of 5 conferences, or a third category of FCS and non-football schools. We also were interested in looking if there was a concentration in certain Division I conferences. So we looked at that as well. A third research question, we were looking at donor nation hotspots and actually global city hotspots as well. And a fourth research question, we wanted to kind of extend this analysis to include coaches. And this is, to my knowledge, one of the few studies that look at international coaches as a form of talent migration. And so the methods that we used, we pulled NCAA data that's readily available on their website. that has data on the number of student athletes across the various sports. We also went to the official websites for NCAA Division I men's and women's tennis programs and collected that data. We coded the data and sorted it and ran SPSS descriptives to answer these research questions. And so the first research question in terms of international student athletes competing in tennis in comparison to other sports, we found that tennis was far and away the number one sport where there's a high concentration of international student athletes. And you can see on the graphic there, it's right around 59% of international student athletes are competing in tennis. So in other words, if you look at the tennis rosters, about 60%, just under 60% of those athletes of all tennis players competing at Division I schools in the United States are internationals. And just for comparison purposes, the average for an NCAA sport, as you can see highlighted there on the screen, is about just over 15%. So this is a big number. The second research question we wanted to look at was this idea of the distribution of international student athletes across three categories of Power 5, Group of 5, and the FCS non-football category. We also were interested in looking to see if clustering occurred in these 31 Division I conferences. And we define clustering is in the context of sport labor migration as the tendency of migrant athletes to co-locate at a rate significantly higher than what could be expected had they been randomly dispersed. And so we were really interested in looking at that. And as you can see, in terms of the distribution across the three categories, the Group of 5 had by far the highest concentration of international student athletes competing in men's and women's tennis. Also, in terms of the clustering, what we found was that there was a statistical significance after running a chi-square test for association for 18 different conferences. And in particular, there were 8 conferences that had a standardized residual greater than 2, which means these conferences are a significant contributor to the number of international student athletes and to the idea of clustering across conferences. So the third research question that we looked at was we wanted to kind of map out this idea of donor nations and city hotspots. And as you can see, the top donor nation is Spain for tennis athletes, England coming in at second, and Germany, and then France. And it's interesting because in the 4 of the top 5 donor nations, this is all based in Europe. And then if you look at this heat map that we're able to produce thanks to the assistance from a colleague here at Western Carolina University, you can see that the donor nations highlighted in the dark red are the nations that produce the most tennis athletes for U.S. colleges and universities. So the idea of the heat map is the darker shade of red. This is a high-level donor country in terms of the number of student athletes competing in U.S. colleges. And then this is just the city analysis, and you can see here 2 of the top 5 of the top city donors for international student athletes are out of Spain, being Barcelona and Madrid. And again, the top 5 being based in Europe. And so this fourth research question, we wanted to, again, extend this analysis to look at coaches. Most studies kind of focus on the athletes, and so we wanted to kind of unpack this. And what we found was that there's about 26% of head coaches and about 37% of assistant coaches right now in Division I tennis that are international. So this was an interesting finding.
Yeah, and so what does this all mean? I mean, if we backtrack just a little bit and pick up on that percentage, that tennis of all the sports in Division I is has the largest net percentage of internationals at almost 60%. Why is that? Clearly, there's sports in the United States that are more U.S. specific, but tennis is an international sport, as we're all aware. So we're going to be able to draw a lot of international talent. The other big positive that tennis has going for it is that the United States system is very, very unique for higher education. It's the only system, in fact, in the world that embeds very competitive athletics inside of its higher ed system. And that is a real draw for a lot of these international athletes who truly love their sport and also want to study at some of the best universities in the world. So there's two main reasons right there. Now, if we look at the depth of the United States talent pool, what we're seeing is that it's not that deep. The best talent, we may be looking at 450 tennis athletes per year that would be, qualified, if you will, to play at these top universities. So you're going to see, because of the fact that the United States players and their parents are very familiar with the country, we're familiar with the prestige of our universities, and we're also very familiar with location and desirability therein, that those things come into play. And so we are seeing the best, most talented United States tennis players, a majority of them falling in line at the best tennis programs in the country. And this is this notion of imageability and then academic prestige. The other area, though, if you look at our findings carefully, that we saw a very low number of international student athletes were in two leagues, the Patriot League and the Ivy League. And what we noticed about those two leagues in particular is that they're also very academically elite and they're culturally homogenous, which is something interesting. And so we saw a very low number of internationals there, and that might have to do with maybe their philosophy, or maybe it's something subconscious, but something interesting to look into in the future. So what are we really seeing with this study? It's really fascinating, and it actually mirrors Marx's critique of capitalism and Wallerstein's world system theory. Basically, what you're seeing is these semi-peripheral nations like Spain and France advancing toward the core. And the way they're doing that is they're feeding the best talent into the U.S. system. And then after those athletes leave college, they're persisting on into the pros. And they're actually winning or at the top of the pro rankings. And so they're in the countries getting the benefit of the U.S. training, and then it's coming full circle back to their country. That's kind of an interesting thing to look at. But what's going on in particular with the United States, if you look at the three groups we looked at, which were the Power Five, the Group of Five, and then the non-football schools, what we're seeing was that the Group of Five, which is sitting in the middle, they're sort of like a semi-peripheral, if you will, in this micro picture. They're trying to make a decision. How can we compete with the Power Five? If we can or we want to, how are we going to do that? Well, this is the rise of earlier what we called foreign talent pipelines, where they would just get to know someone in a particular country and have a constant feed of athletes from that same country. But over time that changed, and we now see the rise and continued expansion of these foreign tennis recruiting services. And these recruiting services coincide with a drastic increase in the percentage of tennis international players at our universities. And what they did was very creative in a way, is they were selling the idea, I believe, in part of, yes, they were providing opportunity, of course, but in part they're selling the idea of leveling the playing field to the Group of Five and the non-football schools, right? Because they're saying, you want a chance to compete for the NCAA title, how are you going to do that? There's no more American talent because we just don't have the depth, so let me help you. Let me bring in some really good internationals, and maybe you can compete. Now, did we see that happening? Well, yeah, the most recent championship, we saw the University of Texas men's team against Wake Forest, and both of those teams had over 3/4 of their rosters were internationals. So there might be something to that. Now, on the women's side, we saw Stanford, perennial powerhouse, hardly any internationals, so they're getting that cream of the crop American up against Georgia. Georgia had 83% of its roster foreign. So it's something to watch in the future. And actually, Charlie, to the point that we made about our phase 2, that's exactly what we're going to look at. in our next study. Let's see, and then the last point, I already hit on the next point about the best tennis programs and that translating to the professional ranks. So I just want to touch on the assistant and head coaches percentages and the importance of forward thinking. What it says to us is, while the head coach number was already pretty high, 1/4 of all head coaches being internationals, what's even more interesting is to look at the growth, and that the assistant coaches are already at 37%. So what we can think about and perhaps project is, if this trend continues, how soon will it be before we see over half of all college tennis coaches being internationals? So what can other people do if you're interested in this research to help push this forward? Go ahead and look at the notion of academic prestige and imageability, and make sure that we're on track with what we are discussing and speculating, which is, does that equate to a high percentage of American talent, right? And then the next one is, I do think that there's something to be said for untapped talent in the United States. To what extent is the lack of depth that we have in American tennis our own problem, right? I mean, I give you some reasons here. We've basically decimated our high school programs, and we've moved tennis to this very elite location, cost, and there's lots of socioeconomic barriers. So it might be of our own making, and we could correct that. Okay, and then the last point, which is a really interesting one, especially in light of all the political nationalism that we've faced in the last 6 or so years here in the United States. But college tennis, is really a vehicle of globalization, right? But what will happen in the future if nationalism continues to take hold here? It's something to think about. Will it bleed into college tennis? One thing that Charlie and I thought about was, we've seen 20 or 30 tennis programs canceled very quickly, and they said due to COVID. But what happened, they basically canceled their programs, displaced a bunch of international talent, and what we're seeing, Charlie and I, as we look at those, where did the international talent go? Another question for research. Did they then displace existing Americans at other universities? Just something to think about. But this has been a fun study, and we appreciate your time.
And with that, I'm just going to put up some of the references that we used as part of this research project. And of course, if you're watching this video, you can just hit the pause button if you're interested in looking through these. All right, so that concludes the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.